As you can see, this is what this is all going to be about. Our speaker tonight, Jonathan Kade, everybody knows him, former WASP president. And a little bit about Jonathan that he provided for me. He's interested in everything. He enjoys sharing the astronomical aspect of that tendency with his fellow aficionados, especially those of the Warren Astronomical Society. He thinks the scientific establishment is generally pretty excellent at what they do, though he would be more deeply convinced that Vera Rubin had won the Nobel she deserved. Okay. What John's going to be talking about tonight is based on a true story, space race workplace drama, this movie that you just saw the thing on, The Hidden Figures. It's a hit film and as true to history as, for instance, Apollo 13 was. But some of the simplifications are made from Margot Lee Shetterly's nonfiction book. He'll summarize the story in a shorter and less entertaining way, but make it entertaining, Jonathan, okay? But also highlight some of the artistic liberties the film took. He'll also cover some stories the film didn't, like Dorothy Vaughan's work with the NACA during World War II, and the career of Christine Darden, a mathematician and aerospace engineer who was one of the 4 women central to the book, but left out of the movie. Jonathan Kade.
Thank you. All right, so I think that trailer gives a pretty good taste of what the movie is about. So it's a really great, entertaining movie, and you may wonder, as I wondered when I was leaving the theater, how exactly true to history it is. So I've been looking into that. I proposed this talk a month ago at Macomb, and so I've had a month to put it together and read the book, and we'll go into it. So the book is actually totally nonfiction, extremely well researched, extremely well cited work of history. That the film is basically kind of historical fiction, but it's many of the main plot points actually happen, just maybe not at the time that they're depicted. So before NASA, so here's kind of the, you'll see this soon enough, but NASA did not just start in 1958. It was the successor organization to another organization called the NACA. So you can tell from their initial seal that NACA was from another time. It was actually started as a result of the Wright brothers' work. It was first proposed in 1912 under the Taft administration, and it was finally founded under the Wilson administration in 1915 on March 3rd, which we're coming up on. Initially had a staff of 12 unpaid researchers and an annual budget of $5,000 a year. It was only passed into law despite congressional opposition because it was slipped in as an earmark to the Naval Appropriations Bill. So that's where NASA started. So the first laboratory that they established was at Langley in Newport News, Virginia, which is fairly, close enough to Washington, D.C. that they can keep an eye on it, but far enough that they had room to expand and experiment. So it was founded with Langley Field, which is now Langley Air Force Base. And as of 1920, they had completed buildings, they had research underway, they had 4 researchers and a staff of 11 technicians. And this is an early shot. I think this is from the mid-20s. So one of the first projects that they worked on was they got a bunch of captured German ships after World War I and practiced bombing them with airplanes that looked a lot like the biplanes of the era. So they had unmanned aerial, they had drones basically in 1917, maybe 1918. So in Newport News, which had been a very quiet, sleepy agrarian town, all of these researchers coming in from New York and New England and all over the place were kind of out of place, and they got the nickname that stuck for decades, brainbusters or NACA nuts, or in less appreciative circles, weirdos. So they actually were, even in those days, kind of a forward-thinking organization. They hired Pearl Young in 1922 as a physicist. She became the first female engineer at NASA and one of 2 professional engineers in the United States at that time. In 1929, she was promoted to chief technical editor at NACA, and every paper that was published in the whole organization had to meet her guidelines, and she struck fear into the hearts of writers for decades after this. They really did well on hiring Virginia Tucker as their first computer proper. So she was one of 5 women hired for the first Langley computer pool, but she stuck it out longer, and she became, within 11 years, the overall supervisor for computing, kind of set up the entire computing organization that we're going to be talking about. So in those days, computers did wear skirts. They, like the computers who did the analyses on redshift and blue shift, they were just hired to do the math that the engineers didn't want to do. And for certain women, that was good enough. They enjoyed doing the work, and they enjoyed clocking in and clocking out and didn't want to go beyond that. But more ambitious people, like Virginia, found themselves topping out. So she was the overall supervisor for computing, and she couldn't really get past that. And so she left for a fledgling startup called Northrop Aviation that allowed her to, that hired her as an engineer in California. And so she became an engineer well ahead of the time. When she was hired in 1935, there were 25 women among the staff of several hundred at Langley. So far in this story, there have been no African Americans working at Langley or in NACA other than people below sub-professional, so basically cooks, landscapers, what were called general help. Even the ones who were helping with engineering tasks were pretty much not put into sub-professional classifications. During World War II, President Roosevelt signed an executive order that said for national defense work, discrimination by race was not to be tolerated. And that actually made a difference, and they started hiring African Americans as sub-professionals at Langley and throughout the defense organization. And in 1943, Langley ordered the first metal bathroom sign that said colored girls that they had needed in their history. Because, of course, the state of Virginia was very segregated and would stay one of the most segregated states for a long time. So on November 11th, 1943, Secretary of the Navy Knox visited for a war bonds show. And so, as of then, you had quite a few. You actually had the first African-American computers who are sort of hidden in this giant mass of humanity. You can kind of see some women here and there. And the future director of the Space Task Group is standing there. So I have a copy. The author of Hidden Figures, the book, spoke at the University of Michigan last month. And I didn't get to see her talk because there were just too many people, but I did get her book autographed. So the cover features this photo, which is the same as this photo. And I've seen news stories calling it a photo of the women covered in the book, but I thought, that looks like too old a photo to be women who were working for NASA. And indeed it was. This photo was taken in 1943 in the Norfolk Journal and Guide, and it was about women who were starting to take engineering classes to help with the war effort. So, in Newport News, with Langley and with all of the provisioning that they were doing for naval ships going out, the population in the general area almost doubled in 2 years. They built a bunch of housing projects, 4,000 homes in Copeland Park for whites, across a wall, 1,200 identical homes for blacks. And one of the significant civil rights writers at the time, I should have written it down, said, "Let colored Americans adopt the double V for a double victory. The first for victory over our enemies from without, the second V for victory over our enemies within. For surely those who perpetrate those ugly prejudices here are seeking to destroy our democratic form of government just as surely as the Axis forces." So into that scene comes Dorothy Vaughan, actually called by all of her friends Dot, although they don't call her that in the movie. She was born in 1910 in Kansas City, Missouri. Her family moved out to West Virginia 7 years later. She was actually very smart. She was admitted to Howard University, which was the most, the most esteemed of all of the African American schools, because obviously higher education was all segregated at that point. But to save her family money, she went to Wilberforce University in Xenia, Ohio instead. And instead of studying mathematics, which is what she wanted to do, she got a BA in education because she could actually teach school and make money doing that. So she actually traveled across the country teaching school. She taught math and English in Tams, Illinois, at actually just up till 6th grade. Moved out to Virginia in 1931 and started teaching arithmetic, algebra, and English at the high school there, and got married. Also was a founding member of the NAACP there. And in 1943, on a vacation trip, she saw a job posting board, and she said, "Well, I can make better money doing that." And she applied for 2 jobs. She applied for laundry duty at Camp Pickett, which paid 40 cents an hour, which was about 25% more than she was making as a school teacher. And she also applied as a computer at NACA, where she would make double what she was making as a teacher. So one of the questions they asked on the form was, "How soon are you ready to start?" And she wrote 48 hours. Despite the fact that she had 3 kids and who were in school and living with her family and in-laws 140 miles away. And so every weekend for the first 2 years, she was making a 140-mile trip, doing 18-hour days so she could go see her kids and then go back to work on Monday. So after 2 years, she had made enough money that she was able to move them up into that subdivision that I talked about. So this is what the west area of Langley Research Center, Memorial Research Center, looked like at the time. So you have so 1146 is this high-speed tunnel, and you can see it's a behemoth of an air tunnel. And at that time, supersonic flight was still a dream, but it was a dream that they were going to realize pretty soon. But it was going to develop and change quite a bit. So there was a quote from basically the campus newsletter called the Air Scoop, which in a kind of amusing play on words, that said, "If the placement officer shall see fit to assign thee to a far-off land of desolation," they really like their old English, "a land of marshes and mosquitoes without number, known as the West area, curse him not, but equip thyself with hip boots, take heed that thy hospitalization is paid for, and go forth on thy safari to the wilderness, and not be bitter over your sad fate." So here's some early plans. This is actually from the mid-40s, 1946. So you have a cafeteria for the professional and sub-professional workers, and then you have the colored cafeteria for the people who couldn't go there. You have the restrooms over here, and then you have the colored restrooms over here that are much smaller. So with the computers, because they were actually hired into a sub-professional level, they were not supposed to eat in the colored cafeteria, but the facilities administrators at Langley, they never figured out who, but somebody was making a little cardboard sign that said colored table and putting it in the cafeteria every day. And every day, Miriam Mann, the lady shown here, was after about 6 months, she just started picking up the sign, putting it in her purse, and stealing it every day. And every day it reappeared until finally it stopped reappearing. And they kept sitting at that table, but at least the sign wasn't there anymore. So as of 1945, they had 20 women, and they were growing fast. The West Computing Center was led by former East Computers, Marjorie Hanna and Blanche Sponsler. Marjorie Hanna was such a forward-thinking person that she caused a to-do by inviting black computers to her house for social calls. The air scoop had another, accented King James English passage that was pretty entertaining. Woe unto thee if they shall make thee a computer, for the project engineer will take credit for whatsoever thou doth that is clever and full of glory. But if he slippeth up and maketh the wrong calculation, or pulleth a boner of any kind whatsoever, he shall lay the mistake at thy door when he is called to account, and he shall say, what do you expect from girl computers anyway? So what did they work on at the NACA during World War II? They did aerodynamic testing of pretty much every class of aircraft available at the time using models. And they had sensors to measure the airspeed. And they did most of the work that they did was around cowlings on air intakes, propeller design, and laminar flow issues. And many of the laminar flow would continue to be a problem through the NASA era and into the modern day. So this is actually a P-51 Mustang. You may notice from the red tail that it's one of the Tuskegee Airmen Mustangs. So at the time, with the war going on, the Air Scoop also published less funny passages, including the really entertaining quotation, "You tell it to someone who repeats it to someone who's overheard by someone in Axis pay, so someone you know may die," which actually was probably the case. So this was from an air show actually over Langley, so this is Langley down here. All right, well, with World War II over, we embarked on a brave new era called the Cold War. And as part of the Cold War, we got really interested in supersonic planes for spying purposes and for, I guess, primarily for spying purposes, but also just for the ability to get places really fast. And so to facilitate that, they started a new airfield called Dryden out in California. And the Sonora, what desert is that?
Sonora.
Sonora.
No? Is that it?
Or is it the
Mojave?
Mojave? It's the Mojave,
Mojave.
yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
And that's spelled
so
wrong.
Yeah.
from 1941 to 1945,
Arizona.
during the war, Doris Cohen, who was one of the computers, got in trouble she was implicated in being too forward-thinking, and so she jumped ship and went to Dryden. But during the war, she published 9 reports about high-speed flight experiments, 5 of which she was the sole author, 4 of which she co-authored with an engineer named T.J. Myers, who she would later marry. So he and she and 11 other people went out to Dryden and founded it. So the same year, not long after, Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier with the Bell X-1. And at the same time, whoa, I really should have. I need to change my status here. All right. Okay, in 1947, with the war over and with the rise of electronic computers, East Computing disbanded. Part of the reason for that is that they noticed that having computers actually working with the project teams that were taking the data resulted in quicker turnarounds, better quality data, and everyone's questions could get answered a lot faster. So the idea of breaking up silos where they just did the same thing kind of gained currency. So in 1949, Marjorie Hanna had moved out west, Blanche Sponsler had some personal problems, and Dot Vaughan became the acting head of the West Computing Group. In 1951, 2 years later, when she had been the acting head for the whole time, she was finally officially given the title. So the thing was, with the Cold War heating up, with all of the European powers starting to give up on their colonial possessions, with all of these new countries starting up that didn't have any existing alliances, it came to the attention of the American national security apparatus that the Soviet propaganda about race relations in the United States actually was gaining a lot of currency with people who looked like people who were being mistreated in the United States. In India, for instance, it gained particular currency when Mahatma Gandhi's personal doctor was denied service at a restaurant in Virginia. So Haiti, their ambassador, was banned from the hotel he was trying to stay at when he was visiting a global conference. And the senator for Virginia said that the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which was created by Roosevelt's executive order back there, is the most dangerous idea ever seriously considered, like following the communists' lead. So he actually was on the other side of the national security apparatus on that one. So this is one of many propaganda posters that the Soviets did too. And of course, the Soviets were racist as all get out, but it made better propaganda if they made this kind of poster. So in 1948, President Truman enacted a pair of executive orders. Despite the wartime emergency being over, with the Cold War ramping up and with the military-industrial complex starting to grow, he published orders that forbade discrimination in the armed services, which was 9981, and in the civil service generally, 9980. And that actually made it much more possible for people, for African American people to get jobs. So Mary Jackson was hired in 1951. She actually was from Hampton, Virginia, which is right next to Newport News. So she was in the middle of this as she sort of grew up and became an adult. But she was working for the Office of the Chief at Fort Monroe. She spent a long time doing accounting work for local charitable groups and the USO. And despite the fact that she was a college-educated mathematician, she didn't think the opportunity was available for her. So finally, after that 1948 executive order, it started to gain currency in the community that people could get jobs. And so she applied, and it turned out that she knew Dorothy Vaughan and had no idea that Dorothy Vaughan was a professional mathematician working in service of national defense. And so she started working at the NACA. In 1953, she was given a new assignment to a particular job. So she had been working in the West Computing Group under Dorothy Vaughan, but she was actually sent out to a project team. And one day on her first day, she asked two of the other computers that she was working with, who were white women, where the restrooms were, and they laughed at her and said, "We don't." And one of them said, "How am I supposed to know where your restroom is?" And so coming back all the way across campus from the west area restrooms, she ran into Kazimir Sarnecki, who she knew but was not working closely with, and sort of just vented all of her feelings about this situation. And he said, so even though he is of Polish descent, he was actually, I believe, born in Ohio, he said, well, I really need a good computer. Would you like to come work with me at the supersonic pressure tunnel? And she said, yes. And so she did. While she was there, she had a run-in with her boss's boss's boss, John Becker, who is the chief of the compressibility division, over calculations. And he looked at the data that he got back from her and said, this doesn't look right. And they went back and forth. So she was going back and forth with her boss's 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 boss, going through her work. And it turned out that he had given her bad input data, and she had correctly computed the output data based on the input data she was given. And he was the sort of man who said, well, you're very good at what you do, and apologize. So he'll come around again. So in 1958, so she actually went to the city of Hampton. So all of the, basically all of the sub-professional men were able to go to Hampton High School and take advanced classes to get college degrees, that basically master's equivalents that would allow them to be promoted to actual professional jobs as engineers. But the Hampton High School was a segregated white-only school. And she actually did go to the Hampton City Hall and applied for special permission to attend classes at Hampton High. And successfully won that, and in 1958 she was promoted to a full aerospace engineer. Became the first black woman, the first black engineer. It might not be true. Thomas Byrdsong might have been an engineer slightly before her, but they were both in the same classes at Hampton High. So it was around that year. So this is the supersonic pressure tunnel group, and there she is. Let's see. So among the things that they tested there were the Century Series fighters, the F-102 and F-105, the B-58 supersonic bomber, and the X-2 research plane. And this tunnel was so good that it went actually through 3 series of mechanical upgrades to enable it to be more and more powerful. So I'm going to give you a demo of the mechanical typewriter, or the mechanical calculators they used from...
So what happens is that in order to do divisions,
this is calculating pi,
successive
or an
subtractions.
approximation thereof.
And does it as we do it in school, it's trial and
355
error. So it will
divided by
try to
113.
subtract what I just entered, which is 113, from this number, and trying progressively this times 10, times 100, times 1,000, until it hits over here. And finally, it subtracts enough of a chunk that it overflows. And it tells it has subtracted too much, and then it starts to move it one to the left and subtract smaller amounts, and that's how it does the division eventually. So let's see how that works. See, it moves. Ding! It overflowed.
So you see it's actually, it was actually overflowing, so you were seeing all of the numbers change to 9s, and that's how it would know that it had gone too far.
And
So this was purely a mechanical device. This is like essentially a combination of a wall clock and a typewriter that was able to do these calculations a lot faster than a human.
divided, and it's the
So-
3.141592.
So this is what they were using,
Something
and they
to be a
continued to use
professional
these through the 1960s. So around the same time period, Vaughan worked with 2 East Computing supervisors to put together the manual on how to calculate, how to do algebra with calculating machines. Shortly thereafter, Katherine Goebel, who is sort of the heroine of the movie and the heroine of the story, hired in. So she was an honest-to-goodness child prodigy. She entered school at 2nd grade when she was 5. Skipped from 2nd grade to 5th in 1 year. In 5th grade, she would disappear from her class, and her teacher would know that she was in the next room over helping her brother in the 6th grade with his homework. The schools all ended at the 6th grade at that point for African Americans, so her family moved 130 miles so that they could continue her schooling at the West Virginia State Institute experimental school that actually went all the way through high school. While she was in high school, she worked at the Greenbrier Hotel. While she was there, she was speaking French with foreign dignitaries. The Greenbrier Hotel is a super luxurious hotel. Her father, it turns out, was working with Dorothy Vaughan's husband. So it's interesting how all these people had all these relationships without ever knowing about each other. 1936, 3 years after entering, she graduated with a BS in mathematics, a BA in French, summa cum laude. She got married to Jimmy Goebel in secret and was teaching high school at that point. She was actually met at her high school door by a representative of the NAACP who wanted to know if she could, if she would be willing to enter graduate school at West Virginia University as part of a class of 3 to desegregate it. So she and 2 men entered as master's degree students, but at that time she actually became pregnant and had a baby, and so she went back to being a teacher and raising her children. And she actually had 3 children with Jimmy Goebel. And just as she got, so they moved all the way from Sulphur Springs to Hampton so that she could start working at NACA. He started painting at the shipyards there, and right before she started working there, he had a brain tumor and died, leaving her with 3 small children and a very high pressure job. And so it was quite a situation to find herself in. So the first rocketry experiments by the NACA start. The SCOUT system, the Solid Controlled Orbital Utility Test, was designed in 1957. In 1960, the first one was launched. They successfully put a satellite into orbit in 1961. This was the most used rocket in NASA history. Variants and new models of it continued to be used through 1994. So that's pretty much the only rocket of ours that we've used quite as much as the Russians have used theirs. So unfortunately, the NACA era was drawing to a close. It was becoming obvious, as after Sputnik especially, that we needed to get into space, and the NACA, as you could tell from their seal, was still an institution oriented towards the past. Beyond that, you had the group up in, you had the Robert Goddard / Werner von Braun group working out of, I think, Goddard and Huntsville.
Marshall, yeah.
And you had the U.S. Navy people working on their stuff, and you had the Jet Propulsion Laboratories working on their stuff, and no one was coordinated. So the order was put out that NACA was going to dissolve and NASA would be founded, and it would combine all these things. So in the lead up to that, so one thing I didn't mention about Katherine Goebel is that she just went ahead and desegregated her own buildings. She didn't see a sign for a colored restroom, so she just used the women's restroom, and no one said anything. So. But as part of the lead up to NASA, they had made the decision to fully desegregate everything, and so as part of that, they disbanded the West Area Computers group. So at that point, almost all of the former West Area Computers were out working in task groups anyway, and there were only 9 people left in the group, including Dorothy Vaughan. So finally, NASA is born. You see a lot of IBM computers over here, some tape spools. So, Dwight David Eisenhower said in his announcement in 1958, "This is not science fiction." NASA combined NACA with the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, which was the von Braun group, the United States Naval Research Laboratory, the JPL, and also parts of the very young, recently founded Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA. ARPA most notably founded ARPANET for secure communications, and that has evolved into today's internet. And then Langley, Ames, Dryden, and other research facilities were all put under NASA's control. So computers became objects rather than people. So the 604, the IBM 604 that the accounting department at Langley ordered, got stolen by researchers and started to be used for their calculations. And it became very obvious that to prepare yourself for the future, you had to learn how to program them. So Dorothy Vaughan actually went to the basement of the building after hours and taught herself Fortran using their IBM 706. So finally, we were ready to catch up with the Soviets and put a man in space. So Alan Shepard launched on Freedom 7 on May 5th, 1961. It was a suborbital flight. He didn't go into orbit. Unlike Yuri Gagarin, he actually did land in a controlled manner, so he was arguably the first person to complete a space flight, even though he was not the first man in space. Kathryn Johnson calculated both the trajectory and the launch window for that flight. So this is Katherine Johnson. So, sorry, in between Katherine, in the years in between, she had met Jim Johnson, who was the tall drink of water in the promo video, and they had gotten married. So this is her at her desk. So she has one of those computers, and you see this globe here. You'll see it again in a minute. So this is a short clip of an interview. A group called the Visionary Project did a long interview with her about her career there.
To NASA, it was mathematics, but it was the same thing all the time. All engineers would come up with a set of equations, and you had to run them through what you call a time history. Maybe it was some data they wanted to follow for X number of days. So you had big data sheets that big, with maybe 15 or 20 columns across, and 25 lines down this way. And you set your variables down this way and solve those all the way across for days. Well, it was fascinating to me. For one thing, I skipped working in Mr. Evans' office after school. He had a calculator, one of these big desk calculators. So I knew how to do it. So when I went to this job, I was already one step up. I knew how to use the equipment. So I got on fine. Then, as would happen, if an engineer in a branch over here was doing specific research and wanted a mathematician full-time, all he had to do was pick one and ask for one. So,
About how many mathematicians, black
at
mathematicians?
that time, I think there were 13 or 14 in our pool.
All women?
All women. Yeah, a supervisor.
Why all women? Why no black men?
A lot of men do things. They didn't want black engineers. They weren't ready for black engineers. They didn't start hiring black engineers for a couple of years after that. And the black engineers had a hard time. They were very, very prejudiced against them. But the black women, that was okay. And they preferred the black mathematician. They said we were better than white girls. For one thing, all of us had been to college. And they hired white mathematicians. All you had to do was know the right people. Some of them were college grads and some were not.
But you settled in.
I settled in and I was lucky. I was sent to the flight research division. And for the first 3 years, though, I did the same monotonous work that everybody else did, but it suited me fine. It was mathematics.
So this gentleman behind the same type of globe, which was called the orbital path visualizer or globe. Basically, it showed the stars surrounding the Earth, so you could sort of see how you could do star position guidance in a space capsule. But this is John Glenn, and he launched on Friendship 7. It was originally scheduled for December 1961, not long after Alan Shepard. In between, Gus Grissom had gone up in Liberty Bell Center. And so he lifted off about a month and a half after schedule, February 20th, 1962. Partly because of technology, partly because of weather. But one thing that he was really concerned about was that Shepard's trajectory and launch window had been calculated by hand. Grissom's had been calculated by hand, but they were suborbital, and Glenn was going to become the first American astronaut to actually orbit the Earth. He was supposed to do 7 orbits, and he wanted to be really sure that these calculations done with an IBM computer were actually correct. And so he had known of Kathryn Johnson's reputation and said, basically, he said literally, get the girl to check the numbers. If she says the numbers are good, I'm ready to go. So he demanded that she actually calculate everything by hand, and it took her something like 3 days to do. It took her about a day and a half to do. He asked, so it's hard to reconstruct the timeline this far back, and nobody wrote things down quite that precisely about these little seemingly insignificant details at the time. But we believe that 3 days before the liftoff, he asked for this, and it took her about a day and a half to do it. So this lady actually was hired to paint. So he asked that she paint a nice looking logo on his capsule because he didn't like the way the other ones looked. So she also features in the film, which is a pretty cool scene. This is Thomas Byrdsong. He was the first African American engineer at NASA. So this is working on the Apollo. I believe this was 1963, but doing more wind tunnel testing. Yeah, this was from the transonic dynamics tunnel. So basically, a tunnel that allowed you to test what happens when you break the sound barrier. So in the middle of the Apollo program, in 1967, when a lot of the heavy lifting had already been done, Christine Darden hired in. And she doesn't feature in the movie. She's featured in the book. She kind of looked up to the women who were doing the work at the time, and she was still in high school for a lot of it. So there's a lot of her recollections, just of being a kid and reading about these things happening at NASA and in her papers. So she was born in a generation and a half after the rest of the women that we've talked about. She got a BS in mathematics from Hampton Institute in the same town that all this was happening in. Taught high school math. Actually worked as a research assistant at Virginia State while she was earning her master's, and actually started teaching classes there. and she was hired at Langley to work on Apollo data in 1967, basically as soon as she got her MS. And she was hired as a computer. And this was sort of the waning days of the manual calculation, and there was really not very much exciting going on. I'll let her talk about that. No.
They called us computers. It was typically a group of women in a room who typically worked on spreadsheets, you know, with an old mechanical freedom machine and a big spreadsheet. You sat down and you worked out equations just on a big spreadsheet and everything.
This is 12 years
So
after.
that's what most of the folks in the office did. Some read film, some worked on these spreadsheets. We all had the freedoms, but they had gotten an old, they also had gotten an old IBM machine, one of the first IBMs was just coming on board. And so, and I had done some programming for my master's at Virginia State. So, you know, so I knew some Fortran and I knew a little bit of BASIC. And so I started reading more about the Fortran here. And so I was one of the only ones in the office doing some of the Fortran and everything. But, so I did that for about 4 or 5 years. But I got very dissatisfied with what I was doing because it was a support role to the engineers on the floor. They would come in with an equation and say, would you write a program to solve this? I would not know what the physical meaning of the equation was, what it was for, or what the answers would mean or anything. And I didn't really care for that. And
So one of the things that was in that clip said, seeing beyond the numbers. And the women who really made an impact and had careers beyond just computing were the people who just couldn't stop asking questions, who really wanted to know what the significance behind what they were doing was. And so they sort of, especially Kathryn Johnson, she just had such insatiable curiosity that she just kept pushing past whatever boundaries that were put in front of her. So, so actually Kathryn Johnson did a number of papers on a whole bunch of different topics. But one of the major ones was navigating by stars and by planets and by the terminator on the Earth or the terminator on the Moon. And those calculations were basically what the backup plan was for Apollo 13. So when Apollo 13, when the computers went out, when they were running on low power mode and they had to basically take manual control and guide by the stars, they went to the Kathryn Johnson paper on how to, on the technique for orienting yourself and actually applying, force on the ship. And unfortunately, the stars didn't work out because there was so much debris around them that they had all these false stars and they couldn't actually figure out where they were pointing. So they went to plan C and actually just looked for the terminator on the Earth and chased that. What's really interesting is that even back then, in the middle of Apollo, they were doing Mars exploration calculations. So that's what this paper is about. And actually, all these papers you can go read on the NASA NTRS site. It's amazing how much resources there are out there. So, unfortunately, I have a story about Christine Darden. So remember the engineer that had the argument with Mary Jackson earlier? Well, he had gotten promoted several levels up, and he was over the organization that Christine was working for. And this is after Apollo. This is in the Nixon era when NASA's budget was being reduced rapidly every year. So they had a new verb called riffing. So it was reduction in force. So basically every 3 to 6 months you would get this book coming down on your desk telling you who was fired, what groups were being dissolved, and who was being you know, who is going to get to stay. And so she got riffed out in 1973 as a computer, and she went and said, look, I would really like to be an engineer. My position is being eliminated as part of this reduction in force, but I can do a lot more than this. And he said, he looked at her work and said, oh, I guess you're right. So she, instead of getting fired, she got promoted to an engineer. So this is a retirement party for Dorothy Vaughan. So one of the interesting things is that Langley took tons of pictures, but they took very few pictures of the African American computers. And almost all the pictures that they did take were in their older days. So it's kind of sad that you can't see people in the time period that all of this was going on. So Dorothy Vaughan was passed over for section head when the position opened up, and so she just figured she had been working for 30 plus years, 35 years or 36 years, and it was time for her to retire. So she ended up traveling around the world, taking her family to Amsterdam, and just enjoyed the rest of her life. And in 2008, she passed away. But according to Margot Lee Shetterly, she was the person that Kathryn Johnson admired the most out of everyone she had worked with. Mary Jackson worked in tons of different sections of NASA. One of the main things that she concentrated on was so this was the era where the Concorde was flying. It seemed like supersonic flight was going to become an everyday fact of life. So Langley did tons of research into sonic or supersonic and transonic and how to get rid of sonic booms. And so she got to the top of her job classification, and without becoming a manager, she couldn't get any higher. And so she decided to retool her career and used her career to try to promote other people. And so she became an equal opportunity specialist. And so for the next 4 years until she retired, she just sort of worked on developing people's skills and trying to create the next generation. And she passed away in 2005. So her technical papers are up online. Christine Darden earned her PhD in 1983. In 1989, she became the leader of the sonic boom team, trying to eliminate sonic booms, and unfortunately the Concorde was about to die, and so that team sort of faded away as we gave up on the idea of everyday supersonic flight. So she moved to the Office of Strategic Communication and Education and worked there for the next 9 years. She authored more than 50 papers in aeronautical design, and so she was one of the most prolific people that we talked about. But she was also building on the accomplishments and the barriers that the others had knocked down. And finally, Kathryn Johnson, our heroine, she continued working on the space shuttle program. She worked on the Earth Resources satellite programs. She didn't retire until 1986. As part of her work on Mercury and Apollo and everything else, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2015. And in May of 2016, NASA opened the Katherine Johnson Electronic Computational Research Facility at Langley, and she co-authored 26 papers. So this is her Presidential Medal of Freedom and her Alpha Kappa Alpha blanket. She is still alive. She is 90. She's 97 now. She's going to be 98 soon. And from what I hear, her wits are still about her. So she's still doing some interviews here and there. So here's a whole bunch of material. So we have a copy of Hidden Figures that is autographed by the author that I'm donating to the library. Her book draws a lot on this unpublished manuscript by Beverly Galemba, just for some of the background and for interviews that were done in the 80s when people were still healthy and alive. And so this was never published, but NASA actually posted it on the CRGIS website. So you can read this whole 100-something page manuscript. It's really interesting. Several articles. This CRGIS wiki is just incredible. They've added so much to it. They have the complete illustrated history of every NASA facility and biographies and photos of almost every significant person who worked at them, at least in the golden era. And it's really cool. That visionary project interview with Kathryn Johnson is about an hour long. That's pretty fun. And if you like that Frieden Mechanical Calculator demo that I showed, Curious Mark on YouTube has tons of antiquated technology demos and does fun things like divide by zero on a mechanical calculator. It actually will catch fire. If you let it go, they have an emergency stop. They have a button that says division stop, and that is specifically to keep it from catching fire. So there was an old urban legend that there was a halt and catch fire opcode that certain microprocessors had, but in the mechanical era, it was really a real thing. So that's it. This is Kathryn Johnson. I just love, it's such an 80s photo, but I thought I would close with that. Yes, sir.
No question, but, well, go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt the applause. The mechanical calculator?
Yes.
My father had one of those.
Oh, wow. Free.
And as a little kid, I would sit there, punch numbers in it, and just watch it. Because it
They're
would
pretty
run for
mesmerizing.
30 seconds, it would run.
Yeah.
Just chug and shatter.
Well, you saw, I mean, that was just a 3-digit number divided by a 3-digit number. Granted,
Yeah.
it's approximating an irrational number, but I have to say, I've watched a lot more of his videos than I needed to for this presentation.
It's not any different today, you throw it out after sometimes.
No, I've looked for it. I have no idea what he did with it, but.
Any other questions? All
What was
right.
the name, where was it made? I'm just curious, you know?
You know, I don't remember.
So Frieden actually had many different mechanical calculators, and the final mechanical calculator that they issued actually had a purely mechanical implementation of a square root, which is pretty cool. So, after that, they started making digital calculators, and then they stopped existing. But I've never gotten to use one of those things, and it seems pretty fascinating.
I'll just buy one
I
on
think the one my
eBay.
dad
Yeah.
had was made by Burroughs. Burroughs?
Yeah.
That rings a bell.
I started engineering, this was in 1968. They had one of those, and I never used it. It was sitting on a desk because it was outdated, because now we use the latest thing, which is punch cards.
Yes. So actually, one of the things, one of the interviews that I chopped out was they actually replaced those Frieden calculators with Wang calculators, and Wang was one of the major companies that tried to, they almost succeeded as a personal computer provider, and they were the ones with the 8-inch floppy disks that were like records. But unfortunately, that proved to be too much for people, and they went out of business. But they almost made it. They could have been the next IBM.
All right. Any more questions?
Great job.
Thank you.
Awesome.